Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance watching the stars drift past through the main view screen, and he felt the same mix of wonder and loneliness that had followed him through 3 years of deep space patrol duty since. Humanity joined the Galactic Federation, and the vastness of space never stopped reminding him how small Earth really was in the grand scheme of things. Federation had 12 member species, and humans were definitely at the bottom of the social ladder, and everyone made that clear in their own polite but condescending way, and the ethereal Zephyrians, with their flowing energy, bodies treated humans like curious pets, while the crystalline Votakians spoke to them slowly as if they were children learning basic math, and the insectoid Krallin simply ignored humans entirely unless they needed manual labor. Lieutenant Amy Foster worked at her tactical station running diagnostics on weapon systems that felt primitive compared to what other species used, and she had graduated top of her class at the academy. But out here in Federation space, she was just another human doing grunt work that more advanced species found beneath them, and Commander Ryan Bell kept the ship running with engineering skills that impressed nobody because humans were expected to be good with basic mechanical tasks. The Federation Council had given humanity exploration duties in the Outer Rim territories where nothing important ever happened, and it was busy work designed to keep humans occupied while the real decisions got made by species that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before. Earth even discovered fire, and Morrison knew this, but he did his job anyway, because someone had to represent humanity with dignity even when nobody was watching. The distress signal came through subspace channels during what should have been a routine survey mission near the Andorian Nebula, and the automated message repeated the same urgent plea over and over again from Research Station Omega-7, which was supposed to be studying stellar formations in the outer spiral arm, and Morrison ordered Foster to plot an intercept course while Bell pushed the engines to maximum safe velocity. When they arrived at the coordinates, Morrison saw something that made his blood run cold, and the research station was there, but it looked wrong, and chunks of metal drifted in space around the main structure while emergency lights flashed red through the observation windows, and there were no life signs showing on the sensors, but there were other ships nearby that Foster could not identify using any Federation database. The attacking vessels looked like nothing Morrison had ever seen in 3 years of Federation service, and they were organic in appearance, with smooth curves that pulsed like living tissue, and they moved through space with a fluid grace that suggested biotechnology far beyond anything the Federation possessed. And when Foster tried to scan them, the sensors returned readings that made no sense because the ships seemed to be partially existing in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely. Morrison opened communications channels to the research station and got a weak response from Dr. Helen Carter, who was the station commander, and her voice shook with terror as she explained that the attackers had come from deep space beyond the galactic rim, and they were not trying to communicate or negotiate, but simply harvesting everything they could find, including the station personnel, and she called them devourers because that was all they seemed to do. The alien ships noticed the Defiance, and 3 of them broke off from the station to investigate this new arrival, and Morrison watched them approach with movements that reminded him of sharks circling prey, and he ordered Foster to charge weapons while Bell reinforced the shields. But he knew their small patrol vessel was no match for whatever technology these creatures possessed. Dr. Carter managed to transmit her research data before the station fell, and the information painted a terrifying picture of an extragalactic species that consumed entire civilizations for sustenance and had been sleeping in the void between galaxies until recent Federation deep space mining operations accidentally woke them up, and now they were sending scout fleets to probe the galaxy's defenses. The first Devourer ship fired something that looked like liquid energy, and it passed right through the Defiance's shields without slowing down, and Bell reported that ship systems were being analyzed and somehow copied by the alien weapon, and Morrison realized these creatures could adapt to any defense in real time, which explained how they had overwhelmed the research station so quickly. Morrison made the hardest decision of his career and ordered a full retreat while the station died behind them, and Dr. Carter's final transmission was a warning that the Devourers represented an existential threat to all galactic life, and the Federation needed to prepare for invasion immediately, but Morrison knew the Council would never listen to warnings from a human captain about dangers they had never seen before. As the Defiance jumped to hyperspace, Morrison looked at the faces of his crew and saw the same grim understanding that he felt, and they had witnessed something that would change everything. But convincing the Federation to take action would be nearly impossible because humans were still seen as primitive newcomers, who panicked at the first sign of trouble, and the galaxy was about to learn a very hard lesson about underestimating both humanity and the threats that lurked in the dark spaces between the stars. 3 months passed after the destruction of Research Station Omega-7, and the Federation Council treated Morrison's report like the panicked ravings of an inexperienced human captain, and they filed it away with dozens of other minor incident reports while the Devourer scout ships began systematically probing Federation defenses across 17 different star systems, and each encounter ended the same way, with complete annihilation of Federation forces. The attacks followed a pattern that Dr. Lisa Parker recognized from her xenobiology lab on Kepler Prime, where she studied alien technology recovered from battle sites, and she discovered that Devourer ships could adapt in real time to any weapons used against them and their biotechnology. Learned from each engagement, making conventional warfare completely futile, but her reports disappeared into the vast Federation bureaucracy where human concerns were routinely dismissed as paranoia. Dr. Parker worked alone in her lab, analyzing fragments of Devourer hull material that had been recovered from the outer rim battles, and the organic metal seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and when she exposed it to different energy frequencies, the material restructured itself to become immune to those same frequencies, and she realized the Federation was fighting an enemy that became stronger with every battle. Colonel Danny Brooks ran covert operations for human military intelligence, and he had been tracking Devourer movements through intercepted communications and destroyed Federation outposts. And unlike the Federation forces, who relied on superior technology and formal battle tactics, Brooks began developing strategies based on Earth's bloodiest historical conflicts, and he studied guerrilla warfare from Vietnam and asymmetric tactics from Afghanistan and psychological operations that other species had never encountered. The Federation military doctrine was built around technological superiority and overwhelming firepower, deployed in predictable formations that had worked for thousands of years against conventional enemies, but the Devourers turned this strength into weakness by adapting to every weapon and tactic. Within hours of first contact, and Brooks realized that humanity's supposed primitive nature might actually be their greatest advantage. The first major Devourer assault targeted the Vortakian homeworld because of its strategic importance as the Federation's primary computational hub, and the crystalline beings deployed their most advanced defensive systems, including quantum barrier shields and probability-based weapon arrays that could theoretically counter any attack, but they watched helplessly as their cities were harvested and their people consumed, while their perfect defenses meant nothing against an enemy that evolved faster than they could adapt. The few Vortakian survivors fled to refugee camps throughout Federation space, and they brought stories of horror that finally began to penetrate the Council's arrogant certainty that their advanced civilization could handle any threat, and the refugees described Devourer ships that phased through solid matter and weapons that turned their own technology against them, and feeding processes that consumed not just flesh but memories and knowledge. Ambassador Kate Williams represented humanity in the Emergency Federation Assembly that convened after the Vortakian catastrophe, and she proposed immediate military cooperation and shared intelligence networks, but the other species responded with suspicion and blame, and several delegates suggested that humanity had somehow attracted the Devourers to their galaxy, and they began using humans as scapegoats for their own failures to respond appropriately to the growing threat. The ethereal Zephyrians, with their energy-based existence, believed they were immune to physical threats, and they refused to consider that the Devourers posed any real danger to their transcendent civilization, and the Krellin military caste insisted that their hive mind tactics and superior discipline would easily defeat any enemy. Once they understood the proper strategy and the Nexari trusted their artificial intelligence systems to calculate perfect solutions to any problem, including extragalactic invasion. Williams watched the council debate endlessly while more worlds fell to devour attacks, and she saw the same arrogance that had dismissed human warnings for 3 months, and the Federation species could not accept that their technological advancement meant nothing against an enemy that adapted faster than they could think. And she began to understand that humanity might have to act alone if the galaxy was going to survive. Brooks received authorization from Earth Command to begin recruiting human volunteers for what he called the Terra Protocol, and it was a comprehensive strategy based on everything that made human warfare effective throughout history, including acceptable losses and chaotic unpredictability, and weapons of mass destruction and tactics that other species would consider barbaric. But Brooks knew that civilized warfare was a luxury the galaxy could no longer afford. The breaking point came when massive devourer fleets emerged from hyperspace at 17 different locations simultaneously, and they began the largest coordinated assault in galactic history, and Federation worlds burned as their rigid military doctrines proved completely inadequate against an enemy that learned from every battle and grew stronger with each victory. And the Council finally understood that they were facing extinction. Morrison received new orders that changed everything, and all human vessels were to withdraw immediately to Earth's solar system because humanity was being expelled from the Federation, and the official declaration blamed humans for somehow bringing the Devourer catastrophe upon the galaxy, and stated that humans would face war crimes tribunals once the threat was eliminated, assuming any Federation world survived the invasion. But Morrison had seen the terror in Dr. Carter's eyes as the research station fell, and he had read Dr. Parker's reports about Devourer adaptation technology, and he knew that conventional Federation tactics would never work against an enemy that evolved in real time. And he made a decision that would define humanity's role in the galaxy forever. And instead of retreating to Sol System, he ordered his ship to remain and fight, not for the Federation that had rejected them, but for the survival of all galactic life. The Devourer invasion reached full scale, and entire star systems fell within days as the organic ships spread through Federation space like a plague, consuming everything in their path. And the ethereal Zephyrians watched in horror as their energy-based defenses were absorbed and turned against them, while the militaristic Krellin found their perfectly coordinated hive mind tactics predictable and easily countered by an enemy that learned faster than they could adapt. Federation casualties mounted exponentially as billions of beings fled their homeworlds in massive refugee fleets that clogged hyperspace lanes and created chaos throughout the transportation networks, and ancient alliances crumbled under the pressure of unprecedented defeat as species abandoned mutual defense agreements to focus on protecting their own territories. And the Council of 12 fractured into competing factions that blamed each other for the catastrophe. The technologically advanced Nexari discovered that their smartest artificial intelligence systems were being hijacked and corrupted by Devourer infiltration protocols that turned their own computers against them, and their perfect logical calculations became worthless when the enemy could rewrite the fundamental rules of engagement during combat, and their cities fell as their robot defenders switched sides in the middle of battle. Captain Morrison ignored his orders to retreat and kept the Defiance in Federation space, where Dr. Parker had made a crucial discovery about Devourer weaknesses, and she found that their adaptive technology required direct neural interface with their prey, which meant they had to board enemy ships and study their victims to counter new weapons and tactics, and this process took time that could be exploited by forces willing to sacrifice themselves for intelligence. Gathering General Paul Anderson commanded Earth's military forces, and he faced the most controversial decision in human history. When the Federation expelled humanity and blamed them for the invasion, and some human colonies chose isolation and prepared to defend only their own worlds, while others rallied behind Anderson's call to implement the Terra Protocol and remain in Federation space to fight an enemy that threatened all galactic Lathia. The Terra Protocol was everything that made human warfare effective. throughout their bloody history, and it embraced chaos and unpredictability and acceptable losses in ways that horrified other species who had fought civilized wars for millennia, and humans began using tactics that the Federation considered barbaric, including suicide missions and false retreats and civilian militias and weapons of mass destruction that violated every treaty of civilized warfare. Morrison worked with Dr. Parker to develop what they called the Chaos Doctrine, based on the discovery that devourers could not adapt to completely irrational tactics, and during the Battle of New Geneva, Lieutenant Amy Foster commanded her own vessel after Morrison's ship was destroyed while covering a civilian evacuation, and she discovered that rotating weapon types randomly every few minutes prevented devourer adaptation protocols from establishing predictable patterns. The key breakthrough came when Foster deliberately made poor tactical decisions that sacrificed military efficiency for unpredictability, and she used random number generators to determine attack patterns and deployed resources illogically, and even incorporated elements of chance like dice rolls into battlefield decisions, and the devourer ships struggled to counter strategies that made no logical sense. Colonel Brooks led human forces in ground combat operations that shocked Federation observers who watched humans use their own bases as weapons and detonate their own facilities to deny resources to the enemy, and deliberately target devourer breeding facilities and food storage, using tactics that other species considered genocide but humans understood as necessary for survival. Against an enemy that consumed entire civilizations, the Federation species watched in horror and fascination as human forces began achieving impossible victories through methods that violated every principle of civilized warfare, and humans used their own ships as projectiles and rigged captured vessels with nuclear devices, and worst of all, from the Federation perspective, they showed no mercy to an enemy that had shown none to them, and fought with a brutality that reminded the galaxy why they had initially feared contact with humanity. Admiral Chris Johnson took command of the human fleet and implemented Protocol Omega, which involved deliberately allowing devourer forces to capture human vessels, but only after installing hidden nuclear devices set to detonate during the enemy's adaptation process, and the psychological effect on devourer forces was devastating as they began to fear boarding human ships, because they never knew which ones were trapped. The tide of war began to shift as human tactics proved increasingly effective against an enemy that had seemed invincible, and Federation survivors started requesting human assistance despite their horror at human methods, and humanity's price was steep, and they demanded full military command of joint operations and complete abandonment of Federation warfare conventions that had proven useless against the devourers. Some species accepted these harsh terms because survival trumped pride, but others chose to fight alone rather than compromise their principles and watch their civilizations die with dignity intact, and the galaxy faced a choice between moral purity and practical survival, and humanity offered the only path to victory, even though it required embracing everything they had once considered barbaric. Morrison emerged from an escape pod after his ship's destruction, and he had spent weeks behind enemy lines gathering intelligence about devourer tactics and weaknesses, and his reports revealed that the organic ships were not just adaptable but intelligent in ways that Federation scientists had never understood, and they were part of a vast collective consciousness that spanned multiple galaxies and had been consuming civilizations for millions of years. Dr. Parker's research, combined with Morrison's field observations, led to the development of new weapons designed specifically to exploit devourer psychology rather than their technology, and humans began using fear as a weapon in ways that appalled Federation allies but proved devastatingly effective against an enemy that had never encountered prey that fought back with such calculated viciousness, and the devourers started to retreat from systems where human forces were present. The Federation that had once dismissed humanity as primitive and barbaric now depended on human military leadership for survival, and the irony was not lost on anyone as the species that had been considered least civilized became the galaxy's only hope against complete extinction, and the question remained whether civilization could survive the methods required to defend it. Colonel Brooks led the first major human offensive against devourer forces at the Battle of Sigma, station, and instead of meeting the enemy in traditional formation, human forces scattered into small independent units that struck simultaneously from multiple vectors using tactics that seemed random and chaotic to Federation observers, but followed patterns based on Earth's most successful guerrilla campaigns, and when Devourer ships adapted to human plasma weaponry, the humans immediately switched to kinetic projectiles, and when those were countered, they resorted to nuclear mines and ramming attacks. The breakthrough discovery came from Lieutenant Amy Foster, who now commanded her own vessel after proving her tactical genius in previous engagements, and she realized during the Siege of New Geneva that Devourers could not adapt to completely irrational decision-making, and she began ordering her crew to rotate weapon types randomly every few minutes, making no strategic sense, but preventing Devourer adaptation protocols from establishing any predictable patterns to counter DR. Lisa Parker developed what became known as the Chaos Doctrine based on Foster's battlefield discoveries, and human commanders throughout the war zone began implementing deliberately poor tactical decisions that sacrificed military efficiency for unpredictability, and they used random number generators to determine attack patterns and deployed resources in ways that violated every principle of military science but proved devastatingly effective against an enemy that depended on logical analysis. The Federation species watched in amazement and horror as human forces achieved impossible victories through methods that defied all conventional wisdom, and humans used their own ships as projectiles when conventional weapons failed, and they detonated their own bases to deny resources to the enemy, and most shocking to Federation sensibilities, they deliberately targeted Devourer breeding facilities and food storage areas using tactics that other species considered genocide, but humans understood as total war. Admiral Chris Johnson commanded the human fleet with strategies borrowed from Earth's bloodiest conflicts, and he implemented Protocol Omega, which involved deliberately allowing Devourer forces to capture human vessels after installing hidden nuclear devices set to detonate during the enemy's adaptation process, and the psychological effect on Devourer forces was profound as they developed an almost superstitious fear of boarding human ships because they never knew which ones were elaborate traps. The cultural shock was immense when more Federation species began requesting human military assistance despite their revulsion at human methods, and humanity's price was steep, requiring full command authority over joint operations and complete abandonment of Federation warfare conventions that had proven useless against adaptive enemies, and some species accepted these harsh terms while others chose to fight alone rather than compromise their civilized principles. Commander Ryan Bell established training programs to teach alien forces human concepts like acceptable losses and scorched Earth tactics and psychological warfare, and the educational process was traumatic for species that had fought civilized wars for millennia, and many Federation officers suffered mental breakdowns when forced to embrace strategies that violated their fundamental beliefs about the nature of civilized conflict. The Krellin faced particular challenges because their hive mind mentality conflicted with the chaotic creativity required for effective anti-Devourer operations, and their collective consciousness struggled with human concepts of individual initiative and improvisation. But when Queen Commander Zixka allowed human advisors to train selected warriors in what she called human madness, these hybrid units achieved remarkable success against previously unbeatable enemies. The ethereal Zephyrians confronted an even greater philosophical crisis as their peaceful energy-based civilization was forced to learn physical violence and material destruction, and Ambassador Kate Williams worked directly with High Sage Luminar to develop compromise tactics that maintained Zephyrian ethical standards, while incorporating human strategic thinking, and the resulting fusion of energy manipulation and human brutality created new forms of warfare that terrified even the Devourer's. Federation refugees watched human-led forces push back Devourer invasions, using methods that seemed like war crimes but produced undeniable results, and the moral confusion was overwhelming as species that had prided themselves on civilized behavior discovered that survival required embracing everything they had once considered barbaric, and many chose death over compromise, while others grudgingly accepted that humanity offered the only path to victory. The war reached its turning point at the Battle of the Galactic Core, where Admiral Johnson led a combined fleet of human and alien vessels against the primary Devourer mothership, and the engagement lasted 6 days and resulted in casualties exceeding anything in recorded galactic history, and human forces lost 80% of their fleet, but their sacrifice allowed Allied forces to strike the killing blow against the Devourer Queen Mind that controlled the entire invasion. Captain Morrison emerged from a damaged escape pod recovered from the mothership's debris field, and his reconnaissance mission deep within enemy territory had provided crucial intelligence about remaining Devourer strongholds, but at tremendous personal cost, and the experience of witnessing Devourer feeding processes firsthand left him permanently changed, and he embodied the psychological trauma that victory had inflicted upon all humanity. The intelligence Morrison gathered revealed that the Devourers were not just adaptive, but possessed a collective consciousness that spanned multiple galaxies and had been consuming civilizations for millions of years, and they viewed organic life as nothing more than fuel for their endless expansion, and they had expected the Milky Way to fall within months like countless other galaxies before it, but they had never encountered prey that fought back with such calculated and creative viciousness. The final Devourer strongholds fell within months as human-led forces implemented increasingly extreme tactics that pushed the boundaries of what Federation species considered acceptable warfare, and the victories came at a terrible price as entire star systems were rendered uninhabitable by weapons that humans deployed without hesitation, and the galaxy that emerged from the conflict bore little resemblance to the peaceful civilization that had existed before the invasion. The last Devourer ship was destroyed in a battle that lasted 3 hours and involved the complete sterilization of an entire solar system, and when the final enemy vessel fell silent, Admiral Johnson transmitted a simple message across all Federation frequencies that the war was over, but the galaxy would never be the same, and humanity had saved them all, but at a cost that would haunt the survivors for generations to come. The galaxy that emerged from the Devourer War was fundamentally transformed and bore little resemblance to the peaceful Federation that had existed before the invasion, and billions were dead, while entire species faced extinction, and the survivors were forced to confront the reality that their salvation had come through methods they had once considered morally reprehensible, and the old order was gone forever, replaced by something harder and more ruthless. 5 years passed since the last Devourer ship fell silent, and the former Federation territories were now governed by the Terran Defense Coalition, which was a military organization structured around human strategic principles and commanded by human officers, and the irony was not lost on anyone that the species once considered least civilized now controlled galactic civilization and made decisions that affected trillions of beings across hundreds of star systems. Dr. Lisa Parker served as Director of Xenological Studies, and she oversaw the integration of human military doctrine into the educational systems of dozens of species, and children across the galaxy learned Earth history, studying battles from ancient Sparta to modern Afghanistan as examples of strategic thinking, and the cultural impact was profound and irreversible as young minds absorbed lessons about acceptable losses and asymmetric warfare that their parents found disturbing. Admiral Chris Johnson held the position of Supreme Commander of the Coalition, but the victory weighed heavily upon him, and in his private moments he questioned whether humanity had saved the galaxy or corrupted it, and the methods that ensured survival had fundamentally altered the moral character of galactic civilization, and he wondered if the price of victory had been too high, and whether they had become the very thing they fought against. The former Federation species displayed mixed reactions to their new reality under human leadership, and the Vortakians, who had watched their homeworld burn, were grateful for survival and had embraced human concepts of adaptability and creative problem-solving, and they rebuilt their civilization using hybrid technologies that combined crystalline perfection with human improvisation, and their new cities reflected this fusion of order and chaos. The Krellan military caste had split into two distinct factions, and the traditionalists rejected human influence entirely and retreated to isolated colonies where they maintained their ancient hive mind customs, while the progressives sought to integrate individual initiative into their collective society, and this internal conflict threatened to tear their species apart as different hives chose different paths forward. The ethereal Zephyrians presented the most complex challenge because their entire philosophy of existence conflicted with the violent pragmatism required for galactic defense. And High Sage Luminara led a philosophical movement that attempted to reconcile Zephyrian spiritual beliefs with the harsh realities demonstrated by the war, and many of her people struggled with the cognitive dissonance of being peaceful energy, beings protected by human capacity for controlled violence. Captain Morrison had been promoted to admiral and now oversaw the establishment of early warning systems, designed to detect any future extragalactic threats, and his experiences aboard the Devourer mothership had given him unique insights into the mindset of cosmic predators, which made him invaluable for defensive planning, but also isolated him from normal social interaction, and he carried psychological scars that would never fully heal. The new galactic government operated under principles that would have horrified the old Federation Council, and decisions were made based on military necessity rather than diplomatic consensus, and human commanders implemented policies that prioritized survival over comfort and security over individual freedoms, and many species found themselves living under a benevolent dictatorship that kept them safe but constrained their autonomy. Morrison's early warning network detected troubling signals from deep space that suggested the universe contained more threats than just the Devourers, and his reports to the Coalition leadership painted a grim picture of a cosmos filled with predatory species that viewed organic life as nothing more than resources to be consumed, and the galaxy would need to remain permanently militarized to survive in such a hostile environment. Ambassador Kate Williams addressed the first session of the new Galactic Senate, which had been established on the ruins of the old Federation Council, and her speech acknowledged the terrible price of victory, while defending the necessity of human methods, and she warned that the galaxy must remain vigilant because the universe contained threats that could only be countered through strength and unity and the willingness to embrace humanity's gift for controlled violence. The economic systems of the galaxy had been restructured around military production and resource allocation, and civilian manufacturing took second priority to defense preparations, and every world now maintained armed forces trained in human tactical doctrine, and the peaceful merchant cultures that had flourished under Federation protection were replaced by societies that understood the constant threat of annihilation. Williams spoke about the moral complexity of their situation and acknowledged that humanity had changed the galaxy in ways that could never be undone, and the methods required for survival had corrupted the innocent civilizations they sought to protect, and she questioned whether salvation that came at such a price could truly be called victory, and whether they had preserved galactic civilization or destroyed it. The Coalition maintained massive military budgets that would have been unthinkable during Federation times, and every star system contributed resources to the defense forces, and technological research focused primarily on weapons development and early warning systems. And the galaxy had become an armed camp where peace existed only because everyone was prepared for war, and the old dreams of universal harmony seemed naive and foolish. Dr. Parker's research into Devourer technology had yielded advances in biotechnology and adaptive systems that benefited all species, but the knowledge came with disturbing implications about the nature of evolution and survival, and her discoveries suggested that the universe favored aggressive predatory species over peaceful civilizations, and that cooperation was a luxury that could only exist under the protection of those willing to use violence. The psychological impact on civilian populations was severe, as entire generations grew up knowing that their safety depended on human willingness to commit acts that their ancestors would have considered monstrous, and many struggled with the moral implications of their survival, and some chose voluntary exile rather than accept protection purchased with blood, while others embraced the new reality with disturbing enthusiasm. In the final scene, long-range sensors detected anomalous signals from the Magellanic clouds that suggested the Devourers had been merely the first wave of extragalactic invaders, and the galaxy that once feared humanity now depended entirely upon human military leadership for continued survival, and Morrison prepared his forces for whatever new horror was approaching, while wondering if civilization could maintain its essential character, while wielding the terrible power that humanity's gift for warfare had granted them over the entire galaxy. 10 years had passed since the last Devourer ship fell silent, and the galaxy struggled with its transformed identity. Under human leadership, and the old Federation was a distant memory replaced by the Terran Defense Coalition that governed through military necessity rather than diplomatic consensus, and every world lived under the protection of human strategic doctrine that prioritized survival over comfort and security over individual freedoms, and the irony remained that the species once dismissed as primitive barbarians now controlled the fate of galactic civilization. Admiral Morrison stood in the command center of Deep Space Station Alpha, watching long-range sensors track the anomalous signals from the Magellanic clouds that had been growing stronger for months, and his experiences aboard the Devourer mothership had taught him to recognize the patterns that preceded extragalactic invasion, and the readings suggested something even worse than the Devourers was approaching. And he wondered if the galaxy had enough strength left to survive another war. Dr. Lisa Parker continued her research into alien technologies in laboratories that would have horrified Federation scientists with their focus on weaponization and biological warfare, and her discoveries about the nature of evolution suggested that the universe was fundamentally hostile to peaceful civilizations, and that cooperation was a luxury that could only exist under the protection of those willing to embrace violence. And her reports painted a picture of a cosmos where predatory species dominated because aggression was the most successful survival strategy. The coalition military maintained constant vigilance across thousands of star systems, and human officers commanded fleets that combined alien technologies with Earth tactical doctrine, and the fusion had created new forms of warfare that were more effective than anything the old Federation had possessed, but at the cost of transforming every member species into something harder and more ruthless than they had been before. The War Ambassador Kate Williams addressed the Galactic Senate in sessions that bore little resemblance to the diplomatic proceedings of the old Federation Council, and decisions were made quickly based on military assessment rather than lengthy debate and consensus building, and she defended the coalition's authoritarian methods by pointing to the constant threats that lurked in the void between galaxies, and reminded delegates that freedom meant nothing to the dead. The cultural transformation was complete as children across the galaxy learned human history alongside their own species. Traditions and Earth's bloodiest conflicts were studied as textbook examples of strategic thinking, and young minds absorbed lessons about acceptable losses and total war that their grandparents found disturbing, and the old dreams of universal peace seemed naive and dangerous in a universe filled with predators. Admiral Chris Johnson remained Supreme Commander of Coalition forces, but the years of constant military alert had taken their toll, and he struggled with the moral implications of the system he had helped create. And in quiet moments, he wondered if humanity had become the very thing they fought against, and whether their methods of salvation had corrupted the galaxy beyond redemption and made them indistinguishable from the enemies they defeated. The economic structure of galactic civilization revolved entirely around military production and defense preparations, and civilian industries served primarily to support the war machine that kept everyone alive, and every planet maintained armed forces trained in human tactical doctrine, and the peaceful merchant cultures that had once flourished were replaced by societies that understood the constant threat of annihilation. The ethereal Zephyrians had developed new philosophical frameworks that attempted to reconcile their spiritual beliefs with the brutal realities of cosmic survival, and High Sage Luminara led meditation sessions where energy beings contemplated the necessity of violence in preserving peace, and many struggled with the cognitive dissonance but accepted it as the price of continued existence in a hostile universe. The Krellin species remained divided between traditionalists who rejected human influence and progressives who embraced individual initiative within their collective consciousness, and this internal conflict had spread to other species as they grappled with the changes required for survival, and some chose voluntary isolation rather than accept the psychological transformation that human protection demanded. Dr. Parker's latest research revealed disturbing intelligence about the approaching threat from the Magellanic Clouds, and the signals suggested a species that had consumed multiple galaxies, using methods that made the devourers seem almost benevolent. By comparison, and her analysis indicated that this new enemy had been monitoring the Milky Way's response to the devourer invasion and was adapting their strategies. Accordingly, Morrison received reports from deep space reconnaissance missions that painted an increasingly grim picture of what was approaching, and the enemy appeared to be a machine intelligence that converted organic matter into computational substrate and had already consumed the large Magellanic Cloud entirely and was now extending probatory tendrils toward the Milky Way, and preliminary estimates suggested they had resources equivalent to entire galactic civilizations. The coalition began preparing for what military analysts called the final war, and every available resource was directed toward developing weapons and strategies that could counter an enemy that treated organic life as raw material for expansion, and Morrison knew that even human tactical doctrine might not be enough against foes that viewed biological existence as an inefficient waste of matter and energy. Williams delivered what became known as her last address to the Galactic Senate as she spoke about the price of survival in a universe that seemed designed to eliminate peaceful civilizations, and she acknowledged that humanity had transformed the galaxy in ways that could never be undone, and questioned whether they had preserved civilization or simply created a more effective form of barbarism that could survive. In the cosmic wasteland, the psychological impact on galactic society was profound, as entire populations lived with the knowledge that their continued existence depended on human willingness to commit acts that previous generations would have considered monstrous, and many species developed new cultural traditions that celebrated military virtues while mourning the loss of innocence that survival had required, and children grew up expecting war rather than peace. Johnson issued the final mobilization order that turned every inhabited world into a military base and conscripted entire populations into the defense forces, and the old distinctions between civilian and military disappeared as everyone became part of the war effort, and he wondered if this was what victory looked like, or if they had simply found a more efficient way to organize society around the inevitability of violence. The approaching enemy sent its first probe ships into the Outer Rim territories, and they ignored all attempts at communication while systematically cataloging organic life forms and analyzing defensive capabilities, and Morrison watched the reports with growing dread as he realized this new threat would make the devourers seem like a minor inconvenience. By comparison, in the final scene, Morrison stood before a tactical display showing the approaching machine fleet, and he transmitted a message to every world in the galaxy, warning them that humanity had taught them how to fight, and now they would discover if the lessons had been enough to preserve organic life in a universe that seemed determined to eliminate it. And he wondered if the galaxy that emerged from the coming conflict would still be worth saving, or if the price of survival would finally exceed what civilization could bear, while maintaining any connection to the values that had once made life meaningful rather than simply possible. The story concluded with the sobering realization that humanity's true test was not behind them but ahead, and the question remained whether they could maintain their moral center while wielding the terrible power that their gift for warfare had granted them over the entire galaxy, and whether the methods required for cosmic survival would ultimately preserve civilization or transform it into something unrecognizable that bore only superficial resemblance to the peaceful societies they had originally sought to protect.